So yes, welcome to the Kant lecture. If you guys have any questions throughout this, feel free just to shout them out. It is very likely I will not be able to see the chat or people also raising their. I guess you can also use the raise hand function. But just feel free to like unmute and then interrupt me anytime. Pinky promise will not be offended at all. So feel free to do that. Okay. Anyway, so Kant, as you can tell, this is his face on the background, and that is his name. Um, so basically, Kant is a framework in debate that tries to figure out what is moral, but we're going to start going over by what Kant says in general. So Kant says he has this example of a shopkeeper, and he wants to illustrate like what do we intuitively find moral. So in this, you can see, there's a shopkeeper. He says, "Hello, I'm a shopkeeper," and the customer says, "Hello, I'm a customer." Now, in scenario one, the shopkeeper says, I could shortchange the customer, but I think that my business would suffer because, if it got out that I shortchange all my customers, no one wants to buy food from me anymore. So I will not shortchange my customers because I think my business would suffer. In the second scenario, he says, I think I could shortchange you, but I'm in a nice mood today, so I won't. If I was in a bad mood, I might shortchange you, but I'm in a nice mood, so I don't feel like scamming anyone. In the third scenario, he says, I could shortchange you, but I think that would be immoral and go against my duty, so I won't do that. Now, the question here is, who is ethical? The first one, the second one, or the third one? Anyone want to take a gander? I guess you can hold up fingers like 1, 2, or 3, depending on who you think is moral. Type in the chat. Thoughts on morality? Yeah. So the third person is ethical, right? Intuitively, we'd say like, if the only reason you treat people well is because you're afraid of the fact that other people might see you like badly, you're not really acting ethically. You're acting because you just want to get something out of it. And similarly, in the second one, even if you do act appropriately, but you just don't do it because you're in a good mood or a bad mood, Kant would say like, okay, if the only reason you're like a decent human being is because you're in a good mood, what happens if you're in a bad mood? Like that doesn't justify you being terrible and being like, I will scam all my customers. So the third person here is like intuitively the ethical person because they're like, we should not shortchange or scam people because I just have this like sort of higher level ethical duty not to. Now, notable things about this example. So in all of these examples, the consequences are the same, which is that the customer is not short-charged. So the consequences are the same. But despite this, all of you answered 3 and not, everyone is ethical. It could have been possible that everyone was ethical. But the fact that we seem to intuitively think that the third shopkeeper is ethical while the first 2 are not seems to suggest that we do think that intention matters. So the reason why we do something, or the reason like why we don't shortchange a customer, the reason why we do that and our motives for that are like matter and are relevant for ethics. And so this is what Kant is about. He says that your intent matters when you're trying to determine whether something is ethical or not. So the TLDR of Kant is that intentions determine the ethicality of our actions. This is a super duper simplified version, but this is basically what is useful in debate because you'll see like people that say util is true. It'll be like consequences matter. And then people will say Kant is true. Intentions matter. And both of them will say, like Kant will say consequences don't matter, and util will say intentions don't matter. Other frameworks like virtue ethics will say like actions depend on like their inherent virtues or like how vicious they are, how they reflect on your character, or how they don't reflect on your character, other things like that. But this is sort of besides the point. But now that we've sort of looked at this and we're like, okay, Kant intuitively thinks that intentions matter. How do we justify why intentions matter? So spot the difference. On one hand, you have this very nice human person, possibly AI generated, although he has all 5 fingers, so maybe not AI generated. And then you have this lion, looks like a lion. So what would be the difference between a human and a lion, right? Intuitively, you'd say like, okay, if I saw a human, this like nice little human boy here, tearing apart a rabbit and then like devouring its flesh on my lawn, I'd be like, wow, you seem like a really immoral person, and you should probably stop, wrecking carnage on my front lawn. If I saw a lion, in the wild doing the same thing to a rabbit, just tearing it apart and eating it and killing it, we'd be like, okay, well, that's a lion. So what in our heads makes these two things different? Kant would say that one of them has the ability to think and it has freedom, and the other one does not. So, for example, when the lion sees a rabbit, it does not stop to think, like, I could kill this rabbit in a humane way, or I could go vegetarian, or like I could do a quick painless death by snapping its neck. It thinks to itself, oh, there's a rabbit, and I'm going to chase after it because my instincts and my desires tell me I'm going to go after this thing and kill it. Now, compared to human, even if it were to eat the rabbit, it would say like, this is probably like a living creature. I can think like it may suffer harm. I will choose if I am going to kill it, I will probably do it in a humane way as much as possible. And if this human were to purposely be like, I'm gonna be a serial killer and I'm gonna dismantle this rabbit and like dismember it, you'd be like, wow, that's pretty sociopathic of you because you had the ability to choose otherwise. So the reason why we treat a lion differently from a human, like why we can make promises to a human but not promises to a lion, is because one of them has practical reason and the other one doesn't. And so what is practical reason? Practical reason, according to Kant, is the ability to set ends and pursue ends or deliberate. And I'll go over this a little bit more in a second. So Kant says that there are three parts of human nature that we need to account for. So first is animality, so that people have instincts and biological desires. And this is something that we have with animals. And so all animals will have instincts, right? As a human, for example, when you're hungry, maybe you get a little angrier. Maybe you want to eat. Maybe when you are tired, you really want to sleep. You see things that excite you, and same thing like a dog. But he would say that when you are controlled by your instincts and your biological desires, you're not free, right? You're a slave to your like biological systems that sort of tell you what to do. Like the lion or like your dog, when your dog sees a squirrel, it doesn't really think like, should I bark or should I not bark? It just goes like, oh, there's a squirrel. I will immediately bark because that is what my body wants to do, and I will follow that instinct, right? And the Kant would say the dog is not free because the dog cannot choose to do otherwise. So it has less freedom than a human. The second thing he says that we have is humanity. And so this is the ability to set and pursue ends. So this is also what we're talking about when we say practical reason. The ability to set and pursue ends is basically the same thing as saying I can think and deliberate about what action that I ought to take, and then I can reason about like how I should get there. So I can deliberate about whether something is good or not. So when you guys were laying in bed today and you're like, should I get up and go to this like super cool, awesome Kant lecture? That was an instance of you using your freedom or your humanity because you're deliberating over whether I should set and pursue my end of attending this lecture. Now, Kant does not say that humans do not have any instincts. He says, while humans do have like biological desires, we can always say no or we can overrule them. So, like for example, if you have a job and you have to get there at 9 a.m. and you really, really want to stay in bed and you're like, I'm tired, everything sucks, I'm sleepy, it's my winter break, I don't want to work. But you can say, like, despite all of your desires to stay in bed, you can still say, I should go to work because it is the right thing to do. I made a promise to my boss, so I'm getting up anyway. The last part he says that we have is personality. And so this is just like your ability to set your own moral laws or legislate over yourself morally, i.e., I set my own moral rules, or like when I set a moral rule, I can choose to follow it. And this one is sort of like less important. I think the first two are probably the most relevant for debate, at least. But yeah, the central idea is that we are only free when we act not because of our desires. And so when we have a reason for an action, in order for it to be moral, it should be because of duty and not other desires. So this in part explains why the second shopkeeper is wrong, right? The second shopkeeper just has this like random desire to be nice and not shortchange the customer. But this is not an action taken that makes them free because it's not because of their duty, it's because they have just like a desire to be nice, like a random like compulsion. Okay, so whenever you act, you justify other people acting in that way. So for example, if I am eating an apple, I justify that other people in my position can probably eat an apple because I just set this rule for other people. It's the same thing as saying like, if I have a triangle, it has three sides. If I see another triangle, or if someone says I have a triangle, I'll say, oh, I know that also has three sides because all triangles will have three sides. In a similar way, Kant will say like, if a human can act in this way, then that justifies another human acting in that way and everyone acting in that way. Something important to note is that deliberation is not a consequence because you're not doing it to maximize an end. Like you're not trying to maximize the amount of reasoning you have. Like Kant would not say you just sit there and you think about yourself like really, really hard. He'd be like, no, like you deliberate just because the action itself is good. Right? It's the same way as like if you make friends, you're not doing this so you can say I have 5 friends, which is more than what I used to have, which is 0 friends. You're making friends because you value the process itself of acquiring friendship, i.e., talking to them, interacting with them, etc. So this is what Kant means when he says that the action itself is good and not just the ends. And so the argument is that if I deem that an action is a good idea and I don't do it, it means I'm sort of irrational. If I have all these really, really good reasons and I say like, okay, well, I want to get out of bed, and I don't get out of bed. He'd say like you're contradicting yourself. So he basically says that when we determine an action to be good, we justify it for other people. So quick TLDR, I do something, everyone else is justified in acting that way. Does anyone have any questions so far? You can also type them in the chat. I will Oh, maxims. Yeah, so maxims are just like sort of a principle that I justify for other people. So if I say my maxim is that like I will eat an apple when I'm hungry, it has an action, which is that I will eat an apple, and then intent is like when I'm hungry, or like in order to satiate like my hunger or something like that. But yeah, basically it has like two key components: action plus intention. Okay, great. So is drinking water cool with Kant? So this is a very nice example. Um, if I drink water, the maxim that I'm acting on is, for example, that human beings, can drink water when they are thirsty and it does not inconvenience anyone. As you can see here from my extremely well drawn photo, this is my water bottle that I own, my water that I own, and I'm drinking it and it is not causing an inconvenience to anyone. So Kant would say, could every single person in the world act on this maxim in an ethical way that would not contradict with other people? And he'd say, yes, we can, right? Everyone could drink water if it did not inconvenience anyone because it would not cause any problems. Okay, so the categorical imperative says that our action should be universalizable. So if everyone performed an action at the same time, I don't know why my voice is so creaky. One moment. But basically he says if everyone performs an action and something contradictory happened, that would be really bad. So we get from this that we should only act on maxims that we can will to become universal law. And what he tells us is that we should imagine what the world would look like if every single person acted on that principle. So to go back to the water example, if everyone acted on the principle that we should drink water, would that lead to anyone's freedom being negatively impacted? And Kant would say, like, in this example, no, right? Because we are drinking on the principle that we like do not harm anyone. So a good example of something that would be bad is, let's just say we're waiting in a line for a cool event. As you can see here, lots of people waiting in line, cool event. And the guy at the end, blue, says, the line's very long, I'm going to cut the line. And so he acts on the principle or the maxim that people can cut in line to get to their destination faster because they don't want to wait. So let's just say he cuts in line. And now he's ahead. Look, he's so happy. He's at the front of the line. Everyone just got moved back a spot. But now green is at the end, and he thinks to himself, if blue can cut the line because he doesn't want to wait, then so can I. So green cuts the line, and then we get back to this. Yellow is now at the end. He thinks, if green can cut the line because he doesn't want to wait, then so can I. So then yellow cuts the line. And then red does the same thing, cuts the line. Now notice that this is the exact same situation that we had in the beginning, where blue is again at the end wanting to cut the line. Because if everyone knew to themselves that cutting the line will get us somewhere faster, the line would be the same. Because if everyone from the back moves to the front, you'll just have everyone in the same position. And so Kant would say that cutting a line is a contradiction, because if everyone did it, your original motivation for doing it, which is to get ahead, would not make any sense. Because if everyone did to get ahead, no one would be ahead, and you'd be in the same position. Does anyone have any questions about this? Okay, fire. The next example is like lending money. So in this example, someone's like, can I have money? And the other person's like, well, yes, you can have money, but only if you pay it back to me, because I will lend you money. And the other person says, okay, like I promise I'll lend it back. And then when the person asks for their money back again, this person says no. So what is the principle they're endorsing? They're endorsing, this person with the money says that agents should make promises that they can't keep when doing so is advantageous for them. For example, I can break this promise to give you back your money when doing so brings me an advantage, which is that I have more money. Now, what would happen if we universalize it? As a result of universalizing the idea that everyone breaks their promises, the concept of a promise itself is broken. So if everyone can abandon a promise if it's convenient for them, then no one will make or believe promises anymore. So for example, if I enter into a promise with Eva, and then I know Eva will break the promise if like it makes them more money, I'll be like, okay, well, I'm not gonna make this promise with you in the first place because I know I'm just gonna lose and you're not gonna actually make good on your word. So no one will agree to promises anymore, and the idea of a promise, which is that people will hold it people will hold it no matter what, sort of becomes like invalid anymore. And so the idea of a promise, or the concept of a promise, is sort of contradictory with itself. Any questions up to this point? Feel free to like message in the chat or like PM me. Oh, I see some. Yeah, is there a reason why people are called agents? Not really. It's just sort of a way to categorize people to say like, oh, you're an agent, which means that you're capable of morality. This is actually quite interesting. Generally in philosophy, there are two types. So you have moral agents, and those are people, Kant would say that they have freedom, they can act according to their will. And the second category is like moral patients. Um, Moral patients are people that we have obligations to, but they do not have obligations to us. So a good example would be like if you fell into a coma, uh, like obviously, if I murdered you and you were in a coma, that would be awful. You'd be like, you're so immoral, you just murdered me. Like that is terrible. But you would not say like, as a coma patient, you have an obligation toward me back. Like for example, if we made a promise to get lunch together, and then you got hit by a car on the way to lunch and you entered a coma, I wouldn't look at your like coma sleeping corpse and be like, how could you? This is unreasonable. I can't believe you broke my promise to meet me for lunch because you're in a coma, right? Because moral patients do not have obligation to us because they're like unable to sort of do things back to them. And so Kant would say, and this sort of depends on whatever author you're reading, that moral patients are generally like probably people with intellectual disabilities or like the inability to reason, but should still be treated as such. So like people in comas, like people who are very like intellectually disabled. He may also extend this concept to animals. So for example, like a dog, like you should take care of your dog, but your dog does not take care of you because it is sort of like a different relationship of that sort, if that makes sense. But yeah, just sort of like a silly like philosophy term. So in the end, what is good or bad? Kant says anything that hinders someone's ability to exercise their freedom is wrong. Because in doing so, if I use my freedom to hinder your freedom, and I say like I use my freedom to murder you, I say that my freedom to murder you is somehow more important than your freedom to live or your freedom not to be murdered. And Kant says like this doesn't make any sense because he thinks that if everyone has an equal amount of freedom, no person's freedom was inherently made better than another person's freedom. Like there's no reason why I'm more important than you, right? And so he would say that it does not make sense to justify like your freedom as being more important than someone else's. And that's why we all have to coexist. So another example he has is like if I prevent you from eating your lunch, that would be bad. Like if I steal your lunch, you could steal your lunch back. Even though it violates my freedom, it was my action that was initially incompatible with your freedom. So a lot of people will have this like sort of hypothetical, which is like, you're in a house, pretty cool. Your house has a Jew, pretty cool. It's Nazi Germany, not so cool. And the Nazi comes to your door and is like, do you have a Jew in your house? And Kant would be like, and people are like, this is a gotcha moment, right? Kant says that you should not lie to everyone because if you lie to people, then no one will ever believe your lies. So the intention of lying, which is to deceive people, no longer works because everyone knows that you're just deceiving them. So basically, Kant thinks that lying is bad. But should you lie to the Nazi that's at your door? And so this is a pretty famous like sort of thought experiment as to like what we should do. And one response that Kantians have to the Nazi is like, if we know that the Nazi is acting in bad faith, or that they are violating other people's freedoms, or they seek to violate other people's freedoms, we can do what's called hindering a hindrance, which is that we are allowed to violate your freedom if you are violating like someone else's freedom or like my freedom. So another example is if you are trying to murder me, I am allowed to defend myself. And the reason why I'm allowed to defend myself is that like I am allowed to hinder a hindrance because you are trying to get rid of my freedom. I'm allowed to use my freedom to protect myself, even if that means like overriding your freedom. Although there are sort of a lot of like problems with this, and we can talk about that probably after this is over. Lots of people will have beef with Kant, which understandable. I also have beef with Kant. But yeah, the other thing he says is that we have a right not to be interfered with by other people. And so he calls this a right to non-interference. Basically, since we're not objects, we have a right to not be treated as a mere means. So what does this mean? Let's just say one day I fail my midterm and I'm so angry, I want to throw something right now. So I go to my bed, I pick up a stuffed animal, and I just like kind of throw it in the air. And I'm like, okay, I feel really good. I've relieved my stress now. Now, is this good or bad? Like, would you say like this is ethically atrocious or like ethically fine? What are your thoughts? You can type in chat, speak out loud, whatever you like. No thoughts on some animal brutality? Yeah, okay, yeah. Right, so people would say like this is okay. Like I'm angry, I throw my stuffed animal in the air, it's fine. Let's just say another scenario, I come back from the midterm that I just failed. And I'm like, grr, I hate computer science. And I take like my baby brother and I throw him in the air because I'm frustrated. Now, is this like ethically bad or good? Like I just throw him against the wall. I throw this baby against the wall. People would probably be like, yeah, we should probably call the police, child protective services, like whatever. you should not be throwing around like your baby brother. Now, what is the difference between the baby brother and the stuffed animal? One of them has sort of inherent value because it can deliberate, it has freedom, it has like this meaning, which means that you cannot throw like a person against a wall like you would want to do a stuffed animal. The stuffed animal does not have any deliberative reason, it does not have value, it does not have like inherent worth, which Kant would define as the ability to think. So this is why you would treat the two differently, and you'd say that one is atrocity while the other is just like, oh, someone being frustrated, it's fine. So this is what Kant says when he says that we're not objects and we have the right not to be treated as a mere means. And so like the TLDR of this is just like we should not use people. The other argument is that any limit on this freedom, limiting anyone's freedom means that we treat them as a means. So like if I were to steal from someone, I would say that I'm using them as a means to an end so I can like make more money. So if I break a promise to you because I want to earn more money, I'm using you just as like a stepping stone to get more money. And Kant says like this is something that's bad. Okay, so Kant in debate. Pull up an F, and now we can go over some words that are specifically used in debate, and I suppose these will be nice and useful. We can ignore the truth testing. Okay, so we can go through a Kant framework now and sort of walk through how it looks like in debate. So the first argument, generally Kant frameworks will start off with two things. First is that they will establish, here is why everyone has freedom, and here's why everyone is a reasoner. Second, they will say, given that everyone is a reasoner, here is why they ought to follow like the categorical imperative or some sort of universalizable rule. So every AC will start off with the first part, which is that people are reasoners. So we can start with the meta-ethic. The meta-ethic is constitutivism. Does anyone know what constitutivism means? Totally fine if you guys don't know. Yeah, that's valid. So constitutivism means like what is constitutive to something. For example, the intrinsic nature of a thing. So what does that mean? So let's just say I have a triangle. It is constitutive to a triangle that it has three sides because constitutivism is the idea that in order for you to be something, you need to have a certain quality. So for example, if I had a four-sided shape, that would not be constitutive of a triangle because it has four sides. It'd be constitutive of a square. If I, for example, had a table, something maybe constitutive of a table is that it has legs that hold it up from above the ground. Maybe something constitutive of like a water bottle is that it holds water, or it can hold liquid. Or something constitutive of a watch is that it tells the time. So basically it's saying what is required for something to be itself, or what is required for us to be able to tell, like, yes, this is that thing. And so constitutivism, at least the way it's used in debate, is asking us, like, what is required for us to be moral and what is required for us to be agents. But this is sort of like fancy terminology that really doesn't matter too much in the end. But Kant's answer to constitutivism, he'd say, like, what is required for you to be moral is agency. So just like how a triangle needs to have three sides, in order for you to be moral, you need to have freedom. And in order for you to have freedom, here's why. So these are some common words. The first one is value theory. So we could take a moment to read this card. I'll give you guys like probably like 30 seconds. Actually, yeah. Cool. So value theory is kind of what we were talking about earlier, where it says human beings have this sort of unconditional human worth because they can set and pursue ends. So if we look at the specific line in the card, it says that when a rational being undertakes an action. And so this is like when a rational being is able to think or have freedom, and maybe like set and pursue an end, that means that they are imposing worth on whatever that action comes from, and that worth has to come from themselves. So a good way to think about this is like if I have a computer, if I have a computer, I could say my computer is very valuable to me because I use it to probably like cut cards, read cool things, give presentations on Kant. But let's just say I was not a reasoning being, I was like a rock. The computer is no longer valuable because I can no longer use it, and I can no longer value it. So other objects are only valuable because I give it that value. And this is why Kant would say that we have this sort of intrinsic human worth, because we are able to give other things value as well. The second argument is rigorous. I'll give you some time to read through this. Um, so the development piece of evidence says we can question everything except reason. What does that mean? Is that we can always ask why and why and why. So he provides this example. Let's just say we take a util framework, and it says that util says that we should care about pain and pleasure. So I can ask myself, why do I care about pleasure? And they might say, we care about pleasure because you like feeling pleasure. And you can say, like, well, why do I care about what I like feeling? And they can say, biology. And then I can say, why do I care about biology? And I can say, because science matters. I can care, why does science matter? And then they'd be like, well, science matters because of some other thing. So his idea is I can keep questioning, like, why you ought to do something. Another good example is, for example, if I order you to get water, I'm like, hey, you, become my slave and get me water. And you can ask yourself, like, well, on whose authority are you telling me to do that? Like, why do I have to do this for you? Like, why do I have to get your water? Like, why did you do this at all? Right? And so Velleman's idea is that if you can question why you ought to do something, it is not a legitimate reason as to why you should do that thing. Now, Velleman says the only reason or the only thing that can escape this is freedom itself. Because if you're questioning, like, why do I care about my freedom? That itself uses your freedom. If you had no ability to think, no ability to deliberate, you couldn't even deliberate about whether or not you should deliberate. So he says that this is sort of like a starting point for everything else, and it's the only thing that you can't question, unlike like other frameworks that may have problems. And so in debate, you would use this argument, just say like, util, you can infinitely question why util is true, you can infinitely question everything else. The only way that we can stop this is with our framework, which means that people do have to have some level of like deliberative and rational agency. Does anyone have any questions up to this point? Let me see. Okay, cool. Uh, this is actually not the best framework to do. So after these justifications, these are usually like your stock justifications. You'll have like regress and maybe like performativity or action theory. We don't really need to talk about those because they're a little bit complicated. But after that, they'll sort of explain, here's why we should be consistent with everyone else's rights. Usually this comes in the form of the angstrom evidence. It isn't in this AF right now, but it'll say, for example, that like, just like how 2 plus 2 is 4 for me and also for you, whatever moral rules apply for me also apply for you, because at our core, we are all the same, i.e. that we are human beings. And so you'll have some sort of offense. It'll usually say, like, we need to have freedom. And this also depends on the topic, and I'm more than happy to answer questions about this after. But yeah, that's essentially what a Kant framework looks like. Does anyone have any questions about the sort of justifying reason part? Kant frameworks are like usually very, very short. Like you can read them in like probably under a minute. Okay, great. Oh wait, question. Oh yeah, omnilateral. Very good question because I'm actually just about to go over that. So perfect timing. Back to the slideshow. So political philosophy. What is political philosophy? There are two. You can sort of categorize it into two things: moral philosophy and political philosophy. Moral philosophy is the question, what do I owe as an individual to other people? And political philosophy is what do governments owe to their constituents or like their people, right? And so these are two different questions. So to show you why, let's just say you're driving on the road and you're like, oh God, I just hit 10 potholes and that was really bumpy. Like, what are my tax dollars doing? Right? You wouldn't turn around and be like, Sophia, why didn't you fix all these potholes on the road? You wouldn't be like, it's your fault that there are potholes on the road. You'd be like, yeah, this is because the government didn't properly use my tax dollars. If the library is not open, you wouldn't blame like an individual for the fact that the library isn't open. You'd blame the people who are supposed to maintain the library, the public library, which is the government. And so most philosophies will make a distinction between personal philosophy or moral philosophy and political philosophy because governments have different obligations to their people than you have to each other. Another really good example of this is like, you steal from me. And let's say I catch you stealing. Now, it'd be really weird if you were like, okay, I caught you stealing from my yard, and now I'm going to become the judge, and I'm going to sentence you to 100 years of jail in my basement. You'd be like, hey, what the hell, right? You should have some sort of arbitrary. This is like sort of arbitrary because you could choose the death penalty. You could choose to execute me. This is like obviously terrible. There's no reason why I, as an individual, am allowed to punish you. You in this instance, you would say that the government should be the one deciding sentences, having policemen to like catch people, and also like commuting jail time, as opposed to like other actions. So the government handles a lot of things like taxes, punishment, etc., that people do not handle. So Kant starts with this, and I think it is important to understand the context in which Kant derived his philosophy, which was that Enlightenment period, 1700s, ration is king. We love science. We love thinking. Philosophy is sort of like, I hate emotional things, and we want to be uh, sort of vibing. And back then, philosophers believe in one thing, which is that property is necessary for freedom. So why is property necessary for freedom? They say that, and this is sort of echoed by Locke and like some other like libertarians as well as Kant, is that in order for you to exercise your freedom, you have to have some sort of property. Now, if you're thinking about Sekol and you're like, property, I have land rights just because I'm like an agent, you're probably on the right track, right? And sort of also the wrong track. They're different tracks. But Kant says that in order to exercise your freedom, you need to have property. But what this means is not that you are entitled to a house or that you are entitled to a specific acreage of land the moment that you were born, right? It's not like the baby is like, oh, the baby is born. Look, the Lamborghini is owned by the baby. You'd say, like, the baby is born. It needs to be able to at least interact with its outside world in a way that is appropriate. For example, the air that you breathe in, right? If you had no property at all, you did not even own the atmosphere, or you're not even allowed to use the atmosphere or the air around you as a public good, you just be like, okay, the baby's born, now it has to die because that air is not the air is not owned by the baby. You'd say in order to exercise your own freedom, in order to like walk on land, in order to grab things, maybe, in order to even exist in a place, you need to at least have a little bit of land, or a little bit of property. So basically, philosophers think property is super duper important and property is necessary for freedom. Now, for Kant, this has a little bit of a problem, which is that, like, what happens when we disagree over what is our property? So, for example, someone who says, this is my house, and someone who says, no, it's not, and they say, yes, it is, no, it's not, yes, it is, no, it's not. This goes sort of back and forth because, with that, let's just say there's no government. They just, like, we're in the wild. We've just staked out a claim and built a house there, a really nice looking house. No one has any clue whose house it is because you can't just take someone for their word. If you ask the person on the left, like, is this your house? They'll be like, yes. If you ask the person on the right, is this your house? They'll be like, yes. You need a way to sort of adjudicate. Now, Kant says, in the state of nature, like, people are just going to fight. People will fight over what is right or wrong, and they will do this using their sort of raw strength or intelligence. So, for example, if I am disagreeing over whether this house is mine, and I really want it to be mine, then I should just kill you. And I just murder you in cold blood, and now the house is mine because there's no one to disagree with me. Or alternatively, for example, I could use my intelligence. I could set up a trap that you fall in, and then I could like maim you or prevent you from laying claim to that house. So the state of nature essentially occurs when you do not have a government. And so this is similar, if anyone is familiar with Hobbes, this is very, very similar to what Hobbes says, because Hobbes also agrees with this idea of a state of nature where everyone is sort of inherently violent. People are violating each other's rights all the time. It is generally like not very good. And so when this person says like, yeah, it's my house, and then murders the other person, Kant says like, this is really bad, right? Because you don't control how strong you're born. Like, let's just say you're born like without an arm, right? If someone's fighting you over your property, like you're probably gonna lose because you don't have an arm, things are hard, or maybe you're born and you're not that smart, you can't set up traps or form alliances or whatever. But in essence, Kant says like, how right you are, or whoever is moral or who is immoral, should not be determined by how strong you are or how like naturally talented you are. Those two things should not be correlated. So he says that there needs to be some sort of way in order for us to evaluate like whose property is whose. And so this is what happens in his solution is that we should have a government. And this is called the omnilateral will. So to answer your question, why is it called the omnilateral will? Omni is sort of all, and will is sort of the idea of like people's desires or people's ability to be free. So omnilateral will is like you unite everyone's wills as like one body, and you represent that with a government. So in essence, fancy word of saying Kant has a government, and that's what it's called. So the government will legislate over property rights. So that's why when you go and buy a house, you will say like, okay, I have to go get this registered. I'm gonna get my purchase like registered. I'll have legal documents backing up like, yes, this is my land. or like, yes, this is my dog, or like, yes, this, or like, yes, when I buy an apple from the store, I have a receipt like proving, I have an apple. So all of these property rights are sort of legislated over by the government, and the government makes sure that people can have these things because it acts as a third party, right? If I'm fighting with someone, I am never going to trust their word when they say that they are right. But if we both agree to have this neutral third party arbiter, then we're more likely to say, like, okay, if we have a disagreement, we'll listen to what that third party says, and whatever that third party says, we agree to take as the law. So that's what the government's for. It also does things like enforce punishment. It has things like jail time, right? Back to the example, like I am not the one. As an individual, I should not be punishing people. And this is why like vigilantism, like being a vigilante under Kant would be bad. Because if I just shoot someone because I determine like, oh, in my opinion, you're like awful, and I shoot you, what's some like nothing is stopping someone else from determining I'm awful and also shooting me. Uh, Government's also responsible for collecting taxes, financing public works, so like libraries, highways, etc. And most importantly, it should maintain the freedom of its citizens. So it should make sure that it acts in a way that all citizens are free. And the way that it does this is that it like make sure it has laws against like murdering, against stealing, etc. And very, very important, this is not to be confused with the categorical imperative. These are two different things, but they are very similar. So the omnilateral will is for governments specifically. The categorical imperative is for individuals. So, for example, on the wealth tax, it says the United States ought to adopt the wealth tax topic. Do you think that we should be using the omnilateral will or the categorical imperative? Easy to type your answers to chat. Yeah, right. Omnilateral will. And the reason why you'd be using the omnilateral will is because it's a question of what does the government do? Now, if there was another topic that was like, Sophia ought not lie to her best friend, right? You'd say, like, this is an issue of the categorical imperative because it's about interpersonal relationships that have nothing to do with the government. So most topics that you will have as an LD debater, at least on these topics, are probably the omnilateral will for now. So anyway, in a healthy conception of property rights, they're disagreeing. But they have a government and they have like a legal document that says, oh, hey, look, this is like a third party thing, and we all agreed that we're going to follow whatever's written in this document. So we have a nice settlement over whose house is whose. Now it's very cool. There is no violence because there's a government, so everyone is happy and people can coexist in an appropriate way. Okay, so problems with Kant. Does anyone know or can think of any like common refutations to Kant's philosophy? If anyone's ever like run a Kant framework, what are something that people say against it? Yeah, so some people will say that he's racist. And actually, we can talk about that right now. It's a pretty good segue into what we can talk about, which is that Kant was racist. Like, no one's going to stand up and say Kant was not racist. Yeah. So first, we can talk about racism, homophobia, and then the util stuff. So first, people will say Kant is racist. He's a very problematic, like colonial European person. And there's probably not a single person in the world that was like Kant was a really cool like women's rights activist that loved all races equally, because that was objectively not true. But if you want to defend Kant in a round, you should say specifically, well, first of all, you're not quoting Kant because he's a problematic author, so you should separate the author from the theory. Second is that Kant's own philosophy would say that racism is bad. So why would he say that racism and discrimination are bad? He would say that like things like your sexuality or your race are not relevant to how well you can deliberate or whether you have freedom, right? Freedom is not determined by other people, and this is something that's pretty useful if you ever get in a K debate, which is like if I look at you and I'm like, you do not have freedom, that doesn't change anything about whether you are able to deliberate, right? That's just a statement in an empty void. Because your agency or your ability to be free is just like it's just inherent in your agency. It is inherent in yourself. Like when you were bored, it was just within you. And other people cannot take that ability away. And so Kant thinks that like anything outside of that is completely irrelevant, which means that your race does not matter, your like gender or your sexuality does not matter, because everyone should be treating each other the same way regardless. And there's a lot like better, there's a lot of good like evidence for how Kant's philosophy can be used in the real world. If you want to talk about that, feel free. Very happy to answer questions after. Um, Same thing with homophobia. A lot of people will say like, Kant says that, gay sex is problematic because if everyone was gay, and no one had babies, then it seems like the population would go extinct. If we universalize the idea of being able to have gay sex, this seems to be pretty bad. The problem with this is, first of all, Kant says that we don't care about the consequences, and also that we can't really predict consequences very well either. For example, if there was to be gay sex, who was to say like there wouldn't be a baby, or that there could be a baby? If you don't really know what's going to happen because you can't look at the external world or like consequences, nobody cares whether like your action would have the consequence of having a baby or not. Second is that, this is sort of silly also because there are a lot of straight couples that also choose not to have children, right? And so this would not be a unique thing. If at least if Kant would say that gay sex is bad, he would say that everyone who doesn't have sex is bad. It's not unique to gay people. Although that might not be the most convincing. But the most convincing argument should also be the one that we apply against racism, which is that like sexuality is not something that we look at when we look at philosophy, at least under Kant's framework, because he thinks that it's something that's not necessary. In terms of collapses for util, there are a lot of like reasons as to why. Uh, so it might need a bit more specific one, but we can cover some like generic overview arguments that people will have against Kant. Okay, the common refutations, people will say schmagency. So what is schmagency? Schmagency is just a very funny word for the idea that someone is like a fake agent. So the idea of a schmagent is like, okay, I know I have all these moral rules that apply to me. Like I know I should not murder, I know I have freedom, but what if I just choose not to follow them? Like I could just not follow them and I could live like this great, happy, and fulfilling life. Now, um, the response to agency would be like, agency in essence is like I can choose not to be a reasoner even if I have freedom. Like I can just opt out. Now, the response by the Kantian should be that like you can't really opt out because you can't choose not to reason, right? Remember what we said about infinite regress is that when you question why you have freedom, you have to use your freedom to do that. So when they question like, should I be a reasoner? Or when they choose like, I don't want to be a reasoner, I don't want to have my freedom anymore, that itself is an act of freedom. Which means that this is sort of like cyclical or turns on itself. The original author, Enoch, who sort of wrote about agency, was like, it's just like a chess game, right? If I'm playing a game of chess, I can just choose to walk away, or I can choose to change the rules. However, Kant would say like this is not exactly a right approximation because whether you have freedom or not is not like a chess game that you can walk away from because you cannot walk away from your freedom without using your freedom. So he would say like these things are not analogous. The second argument is the fleshy objects objection. And what this basically says is like, let's just say I have this fleshy object. It is shaped exactly like a human. Maybe it looks like me. This object that looks like me is a fleshy object. It behaves just like me, but it's actually like a robot in disguise. So a lot of people will ask, well, how does Kant know who is an agent and who isn't an agent? Like if I looked at an octopus, is that an agent? If I look at a dog, is that an agent? Like, there are obviously more intelligent creatures and more dumb creatures. Like maybe an ant is not an agent, but maybe like an octopus is. Or like is a human baby even an agent because they don't really have the ability to be free in entirety because their brains aren't developed. So a good response to this, and what they'll say is a problem if you cannot tell reasoners, is that if you cannot tell who is a reasoner or not, you do not know who you have obligations toward. Which sort of messes up morality because you don't know how you should be treating other people. Like it'd be really weird if you walk up to someone and you're like, okay, if your IQ is like under 65, then I can like probably like kick you like a ball, like a football. But if your IQ is above that, then I will treat you like a normal human being. And so Kant's response to this is first is that we should presume that other things, we should presume that other things are agents, i.e., that we can be supererogatory and there will be no harm. So, for example, when you walk into a hospital and you're like, I'm going to visit my grandmother who's in a coma, you're not like, oh, hello, grandma, and you like stab her. That'd be really bad. You should not stab your grandmother. And the reason why is because like even if she's in a coma, you should still presume that she has agency. Which means it does not hurt to presume or like respect other things if you're not sure whether they're agents or not. And this is why like a lot of people, especially like Christine Korsgaard, who's a very like famous Kant author, will also advocate as to why we should not like eat animals or hurt them because there are also people that we should presume are agents and have like responsibilities towards, even if they are not like to the level of agency that humans have. The third argument is a tailoring objection, which is like, what if I universalize something super duper specific? So the idea of universalization is like, again, if I have an action and everyone can do it and there are no contradictions, then it's a great action. So like if I can drink water without inconveniencing everyone, anyone can do that action. It's great, it's permissible. I shouldn't steal because if everyone stole, then we'd end up with the same belongings as we had before. That'd be bad. But then this person says, like creatively, what if I said, I want to murder like Sophia Tian, who is sitting in a pink room wearing a jacket, right? There's only one of me. Everyone could theoretically act on that action and try to murder me, and everyone would still have their freedom. It's just me that would like lose my freedom. There are a couple problems with the tailoring objection. First is that when you get into specifics, well, first of all, Kant does not look at specifics. He says that we should not take into account any factors from our experiential world or our current world. So like I would not care about like who a person is or like what they identify as or like what they're wearing or like what time it is or where they are because the only thing I should be looking at are like things that are essentially a priori or things I can know without experience, i.e. that someone is an agent. So you'd say like saying that you should murder Sophia is the same thing as saying you should murder a person or an agent. And that principle itself, that higher level principle, is bad. The second thing is that like even if you were to universalize this action, it would still be bad because although everyone could maybe do it in conjunction without causing a contradiction, it would still not respect my innate human worth as a person. And so I think these are probably the most common refutations. If anyone has like any specific ones that they want to go over, I'm more than happy to talk about them. If any, this is sort of like the end of the lecture. So if you have any questions about like Kant versus the K, Kant versus util, or like Kant in general, happy to go over them. Yeah, so intents are unverifiable. So this is a pretty interesting argument, and I think that in debate it often gets sort of like clipped a lot. I think that I guess we can go over the whole thing. So Kant thinks that there are generally several types of experiences. So first, there's a priori. A priori in philosophy means that you can know something without experience. So if I have a priori knowledge, it's something like math. I can know that 2 plus 2 is 4, and I do not, and that is not like based on the essence of experience because it is like an a priori sort of definitional truth. And this is not to be confused with a priori, as in tricks. Lots of people will say, like, have you hidden any a prioris in the F? In debate, a prioris can refer to both Kant and also the tricks, but in this instance, we'll use it mostly for Kant. The second kind of experience is a posteriori, which is that things are based on experience. So, a posteriori knowledge, an example of that would be like, I like chocolate ice cream, right? I would not know that I like chocolate ice cream unless I've tried physically chocolate ice cream and found it to be, for example, pleasurable or desirable. A priori knowledge, on the other hand, is like the sort of higher level truth that does not necessarily require experience. A very good example of this is like a dodecagon has 12 sides, and everyone in the Zoom meeting knows that a dodecagon has 12 sides, even though that a lot of us have never seen or experienced what a dodecagon looks like. And the reason why we know that a dodecagon has 12 sides is because it's defined to be as such. And so Kant would say that his philosophy falls in the a priori, which is that it's in this world that has no experience or that does not require experience for us to know. He can say like in principle it would be bad for everyone to like murder each other because it would not be universalizable, even if none of us have ever witnessed a murder before. Or it'd be bad if like we had this long line with every single human being in the world that everyone cut in because it looked the same. And so a lot of debaters will take this to mean that like Kant just thinks that the external world is entirely unverifiable. And so if you guys have ever debated a Kant debater or like read Kant yourself, a lot of people will say, induction fails. And for those who are not familiar with induction, induction is just the idea of using the past to predict the future. So for example, saying like there are clouds, and in the past when there have been like dark clouds, there have been rain. So I think today it is likely to rain. Right? That is using my experiences to predict the future. So Kant debaters will say that induction fails. They'll say, like, we can never sort of predict the future. We have no idea what's going to happen, and we should not rely on our external world. In fact, we might not even know what our external world is going to look like. And so when people say intents are unverifiable, your answer, and this is a very, very long-winded answer to your question, should be that, like, we can still verify intents. First of all, is that you can't really lie to yourself about what your intent is. So if it's a question of whether my action specifically is moral, then, like, you know to yourself, like, you can say, like, oh, like, I murdered this person out of love. But, like, in the end, like, if your intention was because you wanted to murder them, that would be your intention. And that itself would be bad. Second would be that, like, we can still look at the external world for certain things. For example, for intents, we can use, like, for example, experiences to tell the difference between, like, premeditated murder versus just like murder in the moment. Just like our courts can sort of determine like what is premeditated versus what is not premeditated, we can also use that. Because in reality, Kant does not say that we should never use our external world or that our external world is useless. He says that we should default to using morality from the a priori world because a priori is more reliable, but not necessarily that a posteriori knowledge is completely like garbage or like useless. In fact, like he spent a lot of his life actually trying to prove that induction could work, although a lot of people think he failed. Uh, any other questions? Okay, if no one has any questions, I think I'll just end this off by a fun, like, little metaphysical thing. Um, let's see. So, comes up a lot in debate, as we mentioned earlier, this sort of like idea of like induction fails versus induction does not fail. So, Kant's very famous example, he has these two things called the phenomenal world and the noumenal world, and I'll just type those out. Phenomenal versus noumenal. And so basically, he says that there's one world that we can know and one world that we cannot know. Uh, so for example, he says, let's just say you have a person and they're wearing glasses that they cannot take off of their head. And the glasses are tinted, let's just say they're tinted green. They're like green goggles that you can never take off. So naturally, whenever you look around, everything you see is going to be green, right? If you look at a piece of paper that's white, the paper will appear, it'll appear to you as a green piece of paper. But in reality, it's actually a white piece of paper. Now, Kant says the reason why our experiences are not reliable is because of this. We do not know what has affected our abilities to interpret these things because we could all have these, in theory, all of our senses could have something similar to these green goggles that we could never take off. We could always be perceiving things like differently than what they actually are because we could have a filter or some reason why we cannot experience them. So while the paper may be white, we will always see it as green. And so while, for example, pleasure may experience us to us, it may experience to be really nice. In reality, it could actually be this really awful thing that we just interpret because we have different sense mechanisms. And because we can never know if we do have these goggles on or off, because we can never take them off, we can never trust our senses. Does that make sense? Okay, great. Yeah, that's the last bit of content I have for you all today. I'll pause the recording now.